Grace was a 16-year-old girl who had spent months dreaming about her first solo flight. When she stepped into the cabin of Flight 372 at New York LaGuardia, she settled into seat 3B in first class without a hint of doubt. She clutched a navy new backpack on her lap and smoothed the sleeve of her hoodie over a ticket that had been a graduation gift from her godmother Evelyn. The soft leather seat felt like a reward for her top grades in science. Grace let out a small sigh of pride and gazed at the runway. Then Ms. Parker arrived. In crisp shoes that clicked against the aisle floor, she paused at Grace's row and forced a tight smile that disappeared when she looked closer. "I think you are in the wrong place," she said, her voice loud enough that nearby passengers all turned their heads. Grace shook her head, reached into her hoodie pocket, pulled out her boarding pass and said, "I'm in seat 3B. A stiff silence fell. Ms. Parker's lips tightened and her voice turned cold as ice. Grace felt her cheeks flare. You can imagine how hot shame burned inside her. She could feel everyone's eyes, yet nobody offered a single word of support. No one lifted a finger to speak up or ask if she was okay. The attendant crossed her arms and said, "You need to move now." Grace clenched her hands around her backpack straps and nodded slowly. She stood up and walked toward economy class with her head bowed and her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Her tears stayed hidden behind the window glass. In the back of the plane, Grace found a narrow window seat and sat down carefully. She tucked her bag under the seat and stared at the runway again. She thought about every rule she had followed and every reward she had earned and felt the shock of injustice settle in her bones. Then she opened her phone and typed a message to Evelyn telling her what had happened. Within seconds, the screen lit up with a reply. "Stay right where you are. I will handle this." Back at the front cabin, Ms. Parker stood in the galley sipping a cold cup of water as if everything was normal. A young attendant named Luis leaned in and said that he had seen Grace with a real ticket. Ms. Parker laughed softly and said, "Lots of things look real." Then she added, "I know what I am doing. I fixed it." But before she could move, Luis stepped back with a worried look. He knew they had crossed a line. Overhead, the pilot's phone lit up with an urgent message from ground control. The engines idled and the captain announced over the intercom, "We will remain at the gate a bit longer due to safety procedures." Passengers groaned and checked watches, but nobody could argue. Grace watched Miss Parker's stiff smile falter as she glanced toward the cockpit door. The energy in the cabin shifted, and a slow murmur began among the seats. Grace sat calm and small in that economy chair and allowed herself a quiet smile, knowing that justice was about to take off. Miss Parker stopped at the edge of Grace's seat. A white-knuckled smile bloomed on her lips. Her voice caught in her throat when she spoke. "I'm sorry for the mistake," she said, but it sounded hollow. Grace looked up at her, calm and steady. "You told me I didn't belong," Grace said softly. "You made a choice to humiliate me." Miss Parker blinked. The eyes of every passenger in first class were upon them. An elderly woman with pearl earrings clutched her handkerchief. A businessman in a navy blue blazer sat frozen, his tea untouched, on the tray in front of him. Grace's words echoed in the cabin. "You scanned my ticket, saw that it was valid, then dismissed me because of how I look. Why did you assume I didn't belong?" The question hung like a spotlight. Ms. Parker's cheeks flushed red. Grace had exposed her racism in front of half a dozen witnesses. She swallowed hard and managed to whisper, "I misjudged you." Her apology was barely more than a breath. The silence that followed was heavy. Grace stood and slipped her backpack over her shoulder. She turned her back on Ms. Parker, then pivoted and said, "Escort me back to my seat. I want everyone to see that you admit you were wrong." The captain's orders still held the plane at the gate. Grace's godmother was watching from ground control. Everyone here would know Ms. Parker had acted out of bias, not policy. Passengers leaned forward, murmuring among themselves. Some avoided eye contact, ashamed. A little boy peered curiously from behind his mother's hair. As Grace walked toward first class, her heels clicking softly on the aisle carpet, Ms. Parker followed a few paces behind. With each step, the tension ratcheted higher. Grace's chest tightened with nerves, but she refused to look down. She remembered her godmother's steady voice. "Hold on, I'm not done yet." The thought steadied her, like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. Every person along the aisle turned to watch this slow procession of justice. When Grace reached seat 3B, she paused. Ms. Parker hesitated, then cleared her throat. I'm sorry," she said again, barely audible. Grace shook her head once and smiled gently. "That's enough," she said. The seat was wide and soft, the same one where she had first felt proud so many hours ago. She sat down, placed her book on the side table, and arranged her backpack neatly at her feet. Her posture was graceful and dignified. Ms. Parker remained standing while the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We will depart shortly once certain procedures are complete. Thank you for your patience." A ripple of applause broke out. No one was celebrating the delay, they were celebrating Grace. She held Ms. Parker's gaze for a moment. Then she opened her book, though she did not read. Her eyes were calm, her mind already planning what was next. In the galley, Ms. Parker leaned against the counter, her hands pressed flat. A younger attendant named Louise approached quietly. He lowered his voice. "How could you do that to her?" he asked. She didn't answer. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her like a 100-pound suitcase. She had humiliated a child, exposed the harsh truth of racism on an airplane, and now everyone knew. She thought of her mother's advice to always follow protocol. Where had protocol ended and prejudice begun? Back in her seat, Grace felt a vibration in her jacket pocket. She glanced at her phone. Another message from Evelyn. "Prepare for takeoff. The pilot said we're clear to push back in 5 minutes." Then a second line. "This is only the beginning." Grace slipped the phone into her pocket and took a slow breath. She felt the cabin shift, a current of solidarity and quiet satisfaction. She allowed herself a small smile. Ms. Parker's head lowered in that moment. The once smug flight attendant had met her match in a 16-year-old girl with unshakable grace. Grace turned another page in her book, her face serene. The engines roared to life and the plane began to roll. Outside the window, she could see the runway lights blur into streaks. She settled back, her hands folded in her lap. She was no longer just a passenger. She was someone who dared to stand up, who refused to be erased by prejudice. And she would indeed watch the storm she had set in motion, because the flight wasn't going anywhere until the world learned what had happened today. Grace could hear every shallow breath Ms. Parker took as she stood in the galley, her palms pressed flat against the countertop. Louise had cornered her with the blunt question, "You really messed up, didn't you?" He reminded her that Grace was not just some kid. Her godmother was Director Evelyn Brooks at the FAA. Ms. Parker's throat tightened as she muttered that she had followed protocol. Louise shook his head and said she had assumed things based on Grace's appearance. His words cut through her like ice. There was no easy way out now. Back in her seat, Grace felt the cabin's atmosphere shift. The silence had transformed from polite ignorance into heavy discomfort. Passengers who had once avoided her gaze now whispered behind their hands. She sipped water from a small plastic cup and watched the overhead bin lights flicker. The usual whir of pushback motors and the rumble of taxiing were conspicuously absent. It was clear to everyone that the plane was not going anywhere. In the cockpit, Captain Monroe's hands rested calmly on the control yoke even as his mind raced. The FAA operations manager, James Sandler, had just called back with more orders. This was no longer a simple inquiry. The incident was officially escalated as a priority compliance check. A compliance officer would meet the aircraft upon landing, and every crew action and passenger report would be logged. Captain Monroe's voice crackled over the intercom as he announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We have been asked to remain at the gate until further notice. Thank you for your patience." A ripple of murmurs swept through the cabin. A marketing executive with a Rolex glanced nervously at his watch, literal minutes ticking by. A retired school teacher muttered under her breath that she had never seen a compliance check for one passenger. Grace folded her hands in her lap, her new name feeling more like armor than ever. She knew exactly why this was happening, and it wasn't about procedure. It was about making sure no one else would ever get away with silencing her. Her phone buzzed against her thigh. She glanced at the screen to read a terse message from Evelyn. "The FAA board has flagged this flight. We're logging every crew action. If anything else happens, notify me immediately." Grace slid the phone back into her bag and exhaled slowly. She felt no fear now, only resolve. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, unwilling witnesses to the unraveling of Ms. Parker's authority. In the galley, Ms. Parker paced in a tight pattern, her heels clicking on the aisle carpet as if trying to escape her own thoughts. She had hoped Captain Monroe's intercom announcement would settle the matter, but instead, it had magnified her mistake. She replayed the moment she demanded Grace vacate her first-class seat without verifying the manifest. Bias, prejudice, discrimination. These words swirled in her mind and refused to be silenced. Outside the window, ground crew vehicles in bright orange and yellow inched toward the jet bridge. The aircraft remained motionless at Gate 22 for nearly 45 minutes, an eternity measured in American minutes. When the boarding door finally hissed open, a well-dressed man in a dark suit carrying an FA badge stepped aboard. His presence sent a hush through first class. No words were spoken, but every passenger turned to look. He walked with quiet authority toward the galley, stopping between Ms. Parker and Luis. The compliance officer introduced himself as Mr. Hayes, FAA Regional Compliance Director. He carried a clipboard and wore a stern expression. "Could you please explain, Ms. Parker, why you removed Miss Grace Holloway from her valid first-class seat?" His voice was firm but not unkind. The entire cabin leaned in, hanging on her response. Ms. Parker swallowed as though her throat had been sealed. She opened her mouth, but only silence came out. Then she whispered she thought Grace was in the wrong seat. Mr. Hayes nodded and asked if she had checked the ticket or consulted the flight manifest. Again, her answer was no. He asked her to review the policy on non-discrimination in seating assignments. She closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders sagging. Then Mr. Hayes turned his attention to Grace and asked if she wished to speak. Grace rose slowly, her legs crossed at the ankle beneath her skirt. She held her book in one hand and said, "When Ms. Parker told me I did not belong, I showed her my valid boarding pass for seat 3B. I followed every rule and earned that seat." She paused, letting the words sink in, and added quietly, "But she chose to question me because of how I look." The cabin was utterly still. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat and addressed Ms. Parker again. "Based on this testimony and multiple witness accounts, your actions violated Federal Aviation Regulation 49 CFR Section 382.77. You will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." He handed her a form outlining her rights and obligations. A dozen pairs of eyes in first class watched Ms. Parker sign the document, her pen shaking. When she handed it back, her gaze was lowered. A ripple of applause broke out, gentle but unanimous. Passengers patted Grace on the shoulder, offered her bottled water, and whispered words of encouragement. Some wiped tears from their eyes, ashamed they had not stood up for her earlier. Grace managed a small, gracious smile. She nodded at Mr. Hayes. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "Your intervention means justice takes flight." The compliance officer gave her a formal nod, then escorted Ms. Parker toward the jet bridge. He spoke quietly to her, but the entire cabin could see the exchange. Ms. Parker held her head high with forced dignity, but every step looked heavier than the last. Grace watched until they were out of sight, then turned back to her seat. She sat down and placed her book on the side table, but instead of opening it, she folded her hands in her lap and took a deep breath. The first-class cabin had returned to normal. Trays were lowered, reading lights clicked on, yet it felt transformed. She leaned back and stared out at the tarmac, where service vehicles were preparing for departure. Her phone buzzed one last time. Evelyn's message read simply, "Well done. Justice served." Grace tucked the phone away and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the experience settle. She felt a flush of satisfaction that was neither anger nor revenge, but righteous vindication. Moments later, Captain Monroe's voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are cleared for departure. Thank you for your patience." The engines roared to life and the aircraft began to taxi. As the plane turned onto the runway at about 20 miles per hour, Grace felt the familiar hum beneath her feet. She allowed herself a final smile. Outside the window, runway lights whizzed past in long streaks of white and amber. Inside, Grace straightened her posture and picked up her book. She opened to the first page, though she was not there yet. Today, she had authored a new chapter in her own story, one written in bold strokes of dignity, courage, and the satisfying echo of justice. And for every passenger who had witnessed her stand, it was a reminder that prejudice would never fly unchallenged under her watch. Grace folded her hands in her lap as Louise leaned close to Ms. Parker and said in a low voice, "You really messed up." Grace could feel every syllable ripple through the cabin. Ms. Parker's shoulders sagged as she admitted she had only been following protocol, but Louise shook his head. That wasn't protocol, that was prejudice. Passengers who had earlier ignored Grace's stunned silence now glanced up from their magazines and tablets, eyes widening. The realization hit them all at once. This wasn't a mechanical delay, it was personal, and it was being handled by someone with enough power to freeze an entire aircraft in place. In the cockpit, Captain Monroe's fingers tapped softly against the armrest, even as he listened to another call. Devin Mercer, senior investigator with the FAA, had made it clear Ms. Parker's actions were under formal investigation, and on landing, she would be escorted to a secure area for questioning. Any further comments she made could end up in the official report. When the intercom crackled to life and he announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We are completing a compliance review before departure," his calm tone belied the tension simmering behind closed cockpit doors. Below, the engines idled without the familiar rumble of pushback. Grace took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She was no longer the frightened teenager who had been marched to the back of the plane with her head bowed. She was centered, grounded, like the aircraft beneath its wheels, drawing strength from the injustice that had finally been exposed. Around her, first class felt more like a silent courtroom than a luxury cabin, rows of witnesses seated in leather seats, their faces illuminated by soft overhead lights. An older woman in a pearl necklace dabbed at her eyes as though ashamed of her earlier indifference, and a young man in a navy blazer avoided Grace's direct gaze. Grace allowed herself a small, serene smile. In the galley, Ms. Parker remained seated on the metal jump seat, elbows on her knees, her forehead resting in one palm. She hadn't spoken since Louise's blunt assessment. The same silence she once wielded to control passengers now pressed in on her like an accusation. Her hands trembled slightly, and her thoughts repeated the cruel words she had spoken aloud. "Where are your parents? You don't belong here. Move to the back." At the time, those commands had felt like the exercise of authority. Now they sounded like damning evidence, echoing through the fuselage. Grace glanced at her phone as it buzzed with another message from Evelyn. She read the words carefully. "FAA security will meet the plane. You'll be the last to leave. Don't speak unless asked. You've already said enough." She tapped a quick reply, "Understood," and slipped the phone back into her bag. She felt the weight of silence shift from her shoulders onto those who had once judged her. There was no joy in this moment, only a quiet sense of accountability unfolding in real time, right before every passenger's eyes. Then, the familiar voice of a flight attendant came through the overhead speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your continued patience. We have received clearance to prepare the cabin for disembarkation. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." The emphasis on disembarkation sent a collective shiver through the cabin. No one had moved, because no one expected to depart. Outside the window, Grace saw the ground crew pause, tugs and carts waiting in neat lines as a black SUV with tinted windows eased up to the jet bridge. Two uniformed officers, one wearing an airline badge and the other bearing the seal of the FAA, stood ready. Ms. Parker rose slowly as the officers boarded, each click of her shoes on the aisle carpet a punctuation mark in the charged hush. She offered no resistance as they spoke softly to her, then guided her through the curtain toward the jet bridge. Not a single passenger stirred. Grace remained seated, her legs crossed at the ankle, her hands folded in her lap. The cabin lights glowed softly over every witness as Ms. Parker disappeared. Grace allowed herself a steady breath, her posture unyielding. A hush fell over first class as Grace stood and retrieved her navy Moonal backpack. She gave a small nod to an elderly woman who had offered a sympathetic smile and to the businessman who lifted his brow in silent apology. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, her voice calm and measured. She stepped onto the jet bridge and felt the cool rush of outside air on her face. At the far end of the corridor, the officers waited with clipboards in hand. Grace walked toward them without haste, her head held high. As she descended the stairs onto the tarmac, Grace glanced back at the plane. Flight 263 sat perfectly still at Gate 22, its engines dark against the twilight sky. She realized that by refusing to be small, by refusing to be swept aside, she had forced an entire system to reckon with its own bias. The justice served today was neither loud nor vengeful. It was quiet, impartial, and undeniably powerful. The officers escorted Grace toward the waiting SUV. She felt the cool vinyl seat beneath her as she settled into the back seat, the doors closing with a reassuring click. A final glance through the tinted window showed Captain Monroe watching from the cockpit door, his expression respectful. Grace offered him a small, grateful nod. The black SUV pulled away, its tires humming against the service road. In the rearview mirror, Grace saw the jet bridge recede, the first-class cabin lights fading behind her. Her godmother's last message flickered in her mind. "You've done more than speak up. You've made them listen." Grace smiled softly. She had not demanded dramatic revenge. She had simply insisted on accountability, and that had been enough to transform a routine flight into something unforgettable. As the SUV merged into the airport roadway, Grace felt a calm satisfaction settle in her chest. She knew the story of this day would travel far beyond the amber runway lights. It would remind everyone that prejudice can be halted by one person's courage, and that justice, once set in motion, does not hurry. It prevails. Grace didn't ask for attention. She just wanted to board her flight and enjoy her seat. Yet now the entire cabin watched her with uneasy curiosity. The galley curtain snapped open as two figures stepped aboard. The first was a tall woman in a black FAA uniform. The second, a clean-shaven man in a dark suit. Neither spoke. Their presence felt like an avalanche. Grace sat perfectly still in seat 3B, her posture calm and measured. No tremor shook her hands. She watched them stride past business class into first class. Passengers leaned forward, their whispered questions hanging in the stale, recycled air. This was no missing luggage or broken engine. It was a reckoning. The FAA officer stopped at Grace's row and looked down. "Ms. Holloway?" she asked in a firm voice. Grace nodded. "I am Officer Rhodes," the woman continued. "I'm here on behalf of Director Brooks. We'll escort you off this plane last. Is that clear?" "Yes," Grace said, her voice steady. The man beside Officer Rhodes added, "We'll detain a crew member for questioning." Immediately the whispers swelled. Who was Grace? Why was the crew member under arrest? Passengers craned their necks toward the galley. A hush fell over first class as Ms. Parker emerged, pale and shaking. She moved slowly, escorted by an airline supervisor and a security guard. Though she wore no handcuffs, she might as well have been cuffed. Every eye fixated on Ms. Parker, the woman who had yelled at Grace just hours earlier. She glanced at Grace, her eyes trembling with shame. But Grace didn't flinch. She held her gaze without anger, without pity. That quiet defiance cut deeper than any shouted apology. Ms. Parker stepped into the jet bridge and disappeared. No applause broke out. No one cheered. Instead, the silence pressed down like a jury's verdict. One business-class passenger leaned to his neighbor and whispered, "She's the reason we never left the gate." Another muttered, "Her career is over." Back in the galley, Ms. Parker faced an FAA representative with a clipboard. She had once prided herself on never being the problem. Now she was under bright lights and sharp questions. The intercom buzzed again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin disembarkation shortly. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off." Passengers waited, some shifting uncomfortably, all fully aware this was no routine delay. Luis, the kind junior attendant, found Grace and quietly said, "They'll call you when it's your turn." Grace nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, though he had done more than mere courtesy would allow. A senior advisor cleared her throat and slid a summary across the table. Not one first-class passenger was questioned. Grace never raised her voice, never flinched. The words hung in the air like a gale. Raines finally nodded. "We have a brief window to fix this before it becomes national news." Legal counsel confirmed Ms. Parker's immediate suspension without pay, and the FAA's expectation of full cooperation left no room for negotiation. No one objected. Within minutes, the board drafted a sweeping memorandum. Mandatory bias training for every flight attendant, strict ticket verification protocols, new procedures for handling complaints involving minors, and a direct reporting line between the airline and the FAA for any incident of discrimination. Raines set his jaw. "When this hits the press, we'll show the world we've changed something real." Across town, Grace sat curled in an armchair in her godmother's quiet hotel suite, oversized hoodie and a warm cup of tea in hand. Overhead, the runway lights flickered through the window pane. Her heart still fluttered from the day's events, but she felt a surprising calm. Evelyn Brooks, director of aviation safety at the FAA, leaned back in her own chair with a soft smile. "You don't have to relive it all tonight," Grace offered. Evelyn shook her head. "I'm not tired." Grace looked at her steaming tea. "You always said change is slow." Evelyn glanced at her laptop. "It is, but brave honesty can speed things up." Grace's fingers tightened around the cup. "I didn't feel brave." Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "You didn't need courage. You simply spoke the truth." Below, on the tarmac, another plane lifted into the night sky, its engines roaring softly in the distance. Someone aboard that flight likely felt invisible, just as Grace once had. Now Grace closed her eyes, letting the warmth settle in her chest. She didn't need a formal apology or front-page headlines. As Evelyn leaned forward to draft the final lines of the policy proposal, Grace whispered into the quiet suite, "Thank you." And with that, a new chapter began, not with vengeance, but with a powerful, lasting shift toward justice. "You don't have to be famous," Evelyn said softly as Grace stared out at the twinkling tarmac lights. "They just need to know what happened and why it mattered." Grace's throat tightened. "Do you think it'll really change anything?" Evelyn took a slow sip of coffee. "It already has." By week's end, every major news outlet had picked up the story. Morning shows replayed the silent footage of Grace walking calmly down the jet bridge. Civil rights groups issued statements. Hashtags like "grounded girl" trended, not because she screamed or raged, but because she refused to speak until the truth spoke for her. In airports from Boston to Los Angeles, employees whispered about the first-class incident not as gossip, but as a lesson in dignity. Inside the airline's headquarters, CEO Martin Raines announced permanent termination for Ms. Parker, mandatory bias trainings, and a two-step ticket verification process. Unions demanded stronger whistleblower protections. Boarding procedures were rewritten. A quiet revolution had begun. No fanfare, but unshakable. Months later, Grace sat in a community hall surrounded by curious teens. "Were you scared?" one asked. She smiled gently. "A little, but I knew I didn't do anything wrong, and I knew someone had my back." In that hush, the power of silence carried louder than any roar. Grace sat on the porch with Evelyn, legs tucked beneath her, sipping warm apple cider as the sunset bathed the yard in gold. It felt peaceful, but Grace couldn't forget the sharp sting of Ms. Parker's words that day. "You don't belong here." Even months later, that cruelty cut deep. Grace turned to Evelyn. "Every time I boarded a plane before, I wondered if I belonged," she murmured. "Now I don't. I just sit." She felt both pity and relief. Pity for the woman who had let prejudice rule her actions, and relief that Ms. Parker had been fired and a two-step ticket check was now standard across the airline. The world had shifted. The CEO announced bias training in shared boardrooms. Flight attendants found themselves retrained monthly, and whistleblower protections went from paper promises to real policies. One phone call, one girl's quiet resolve, had forced an entire system to halt at 30,000 feet. Grace leaned back, studying the fading sky. She didn't need revenge or a protest sign. Truth had been her weapon, and it had been enough. The sky was open to her again, and so was respect, for her and for every passenger, with nothing more than a ticket and the right to be treated fairly.